This is my confession, my warning, and maybe just maybe a desperate plea for forgiveness. My name is Daniel Sullivan, and 6 months ago, I had the perfect life. Or so I thought. Back then, I was living the American dream. A corner office on the 47th floor of Chicago's Merchandise Mart. A wife who looked at me like I was still the guy she fell in love with in college. And my little girl, 6 years old, with a smile so bright, it could chase away the darkest storm. We had it all. A sleek lakefront condo that made my parents' old house look like a shoebox. Matching BMWs parked in the garage. Summers spent in a cozy cottage up in Door County, where life felt simple and perfect. But life's never as perfect as it seems, is it? It all started with the audit. At first it was harmless. Just a couple of football bets. Nothing major. 100 here, 200 there. But gambling has a way of sinking its claws into you. It grows like a cancer. Quiet. Unstoppable. Before I knew it, I was betting on everything. Baseball, basketball, horse racing. Anything that gave me a shot at chasing that thrill. When I lost, I bet more. Double or nothing. When I won, I couldn't stop. Always hungry for that next rush, that next win. And when the money ran out, well, that's when I crossed the line. I told myself it was temporary. Just a short-term loan from a few client accounts. No one would notice. I'd win it back, pay it back, and no harm done. Except that's not how it works, is it? And now my perfect life is crumbling faster than I can pick up the pieces. I told myself I'd win it back, that I'd replace the money before anyone noticed. But someone did. The compliance department caught the discrepancies during a routine audit. Over $2 million gone. The moment they uncovered it, my world started to crumble. 2 weeks after the indictment, Sandra left me. I came home from a meeting with my lawyer to find her wedding ring sitting on the kitchen counter. Beside it, a note. I can't do this anymore. Emma needs at least one parent she can look up to. My lawyer managed to keep me out of prison, barely. The plea deal left me broke and blacklisted from finance. But hey, at least I wasn't in an orange jumpsuit. I spent the next 3 months sleeping in my truck, hustling for odd jobs just to scrape together enough for gas and cheap food. Every mile I drove felt heavier than the last, but I didn't have much choice. That's when I found the listing. It was buried on one of those obscure job boards you only discover when desperation drives you past the first page of Google. Night desk clerk wanted, Blue Swallow Motel, Route 66, New Mexico, $50 an hour, cash, no questions asked, must be willing to work alone, must follow all posted rules, immediate start available. I should have known better. In my old life, I would have dismissed it without a second thought. Too good to be true. Too many red flags. But 3 months of truck stop showers and convenience store coffee will wear down anyone's judgment. Besides, I was 3 months behind on child support, and Sandra's lawyer was threatening court action. I didn't have time to think about risks, so I did the only thing I could. I pointed my beat-up Ford F-150 toward New Mexico and hoped for the best. I watched the Midwest slowly dissolve into endless plains, then into the barren expanse of desert, all through a cracked windshield. The radio was unreliable, cutting in and out with static-filled fragments of old country songs and fire and brimstone preachers warning about the wages of sin. Maybe I should have paid more attention to those warnings. The sun was sinking low on the horizon when I finally saw it. The sign. A massive neon bird swooping over blocky letters that spelled out Blue Swallow Motel. The word vacancy pulsed beneath it like a heartbeat, erratic and uneasy. The whole scene looked like it had been ripped straight from a 1950s postcard, if that postcard had been left to fade and fray at the edges. The neon flickered just enough to make my eyes ache if I stared too long. The motel itself sprawled across a desolate patch of desert, its buildings forming a horseshoe around a central courtyard. The architecture was classic Americana, faded turquoise adobe walls with red trim that had seen better decades. The parking lot was dotted with vintage cars, rusted relics of another era. One, in particular, caught my eye. A decaying 1967 Pontiac GTO that seemed to have settled into the earth near the office, as if it had grown roots and decided to stay forever. I pulled my beat-up truck into an empty spot, the suspension groaning loudly as it rolled over a pothole. I winced at the sound, but the truck had held together this long. It wasn't about to quit on me now. The dashboard clock read 6:43 p.m., but the desert light made it feel much later. The air outside was unnervingly still, thick with that peculiar quiet that descends just before nightfall. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The office door creaked on rusty hinges as I pushed it open, a small brass bell jangling above me. The sound hung in the air for far too long, unnatural in its persistence. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old books and stale cigarette smoke, with an unsettling undercurrent of something sickly sweet. It was the kind of smell that reminded me of the funeral home where my father's wake was held, cloying, heavy, and impossible to forget. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hesitant. It felt like the air itself swallowed my words, absorbed by the dark wood paneling that lined the walls. Silence. The front desk stood at the far end of the room, a relic of another time, made of dark wood with tarnished brass fixtures. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. A shoebox filled with old postcards sat next to a massive leather-bound guest ledger that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. Overhead, an ancient oscillating fan creaked as it swept back and forth, stirring up dust in the fading sunlight that streamed through warped Venetian blinds. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. That's when I noticed the first postcard. It sat on the desk, almost deliberately placed, its yellowed edges curling with age. The handwriting on it was shaky but deliberate, like someone had written it with trembling hands, trying to keep the letter steady. Rule 1. Keep the neon vacancy sign off after midnight. The neon flickers. It attracts things that shouldn't stop by. I let out a nervous laugh, brushing it off as some kind of joke. But then I saw another postcard, and another. Each one made the room feel colder. Rule 2. Don't touch personal belongings left behind by guests. Some of those things don't belong to them anymore, and they won't belong to you either. Rule 3. If a guest asks you to lock them in, do it. No questions. They know what's out there better than you do. My throat tightened as I picked up the next one. Rule 4. Leave the front desk by 3:13 a.m. No exceptions. You don't want to be here when the lights flicker again. Rule 5. Ignore any animal noises from the parking lot. Coyotes shouldn't sound like children crying. Rule 6. If a car arrives with no driver, send it to the far lot. Don't let it park near the rooms. That's not where it belongs. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest now. Rule 7. If you find an unaddressed postcard in the mailbox, don't open it. The invitation is already written. Don't be curious. Rule 8. Never leave the motel before dawn. You might leave, but you won't stay gone. I was still staring at the pile of postcards when a voice behind me nearly made me jump out of my skin. They're important, you know. More important than you can imagine. I spun around to find an elderly man standing in the doorway to what looked like a back office. He was wearing a cardigan, despite the desert heat, and his eyes had that glazed, faraway look I'd seen in my grandfather's nursing home. But there was something else in his gaze. A desperate intensity that made me want to look away. "Jesus, you scared me," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "Are you Mr. Harrison? We spoke on the phone about the job." He shook his head slowly, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Harrison's been gone a long time now. I'm just the caretaker. Name's Frank," the old man said without offering his hand. "You must be Daniel Sullivan." "Danny," I corrected automatically. "About these rules." "Follow them," Frank cut me off sharply. "To the letter. No exceptions." He shuffled forward, placing a ring of brass keys on the desk. "Your shift starts at midnight. The rules will explain everything else." He turned to leave, but hesitated in the doorway. "Danny?" I looked up. "The postcards. Don't ignore them. They're how it spreads." "How what spreads?" I asked, my stomach twisting. But Frank was already gone, the door to the back office clicking shut with a finality that left me cold. I spent the next few hours getting acquainted with the front desk. The systems were as outdated as the motel itself. A massive leather-bound guest ledger, a shoebox for receipts, and a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum. The ledger was particularly fascinating in a morbid way. Pages upon pages of guest signatures spanning decades, many marked with strange symbols or notes I couldn't decipher. At 11:30 p.m., just as I was settling into the eerie stillness, the bell above the door chimed. I hadn't heard any cars pull up. That was my first warning. A woman stepped inside, wearing a red windbreaker that seemed far too heavy for the desert heat. She was painfully thin, her cheeks hollow, and her eyes ringed with dark shadows that looked almost like bruises. Clutched tightly to her chest was a small leather bag, as if it contained the last thing she owned. "Welcome to the Blue Swallow," I said, forcing a professional tone to mask my unease. "Checking in?" She nodded but didn't speak, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something, or hiding from it. When she finally did speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Room 3, please. It has to be room 3. Her insistence made my stomach tighten. I flipped through the ledger and saw that room 3 was available, but something about it didn't sit right. The last entry for that room was 3 months old, marked with one of those strange symbols, a spiral with an eye at its center. "Can I get your name for the register?" I asked cautiously. "Marie," she said. "Marie Collins." She dropped a crumpled stack of bills on the counter. "I'll pay cash." Then she leaned in close, so close I could smell a faint metallic tang on her breath. "If I knock on your door tonight, don't open it, no matter what I say, no matter how much I beg. Promise me." My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. "I promise." She snatched the key from my hand and hurried down the hallway, her red windbreaker dragging along the floor like a shadow come to life. I watched as she disappeared into room 3, the door closing behind her with a quiet but unsettling finality. After she left, I inspected the cash she'd handed over. The bills were old, 1950s series. The paper felt wrong, softer, like it had been washed too many times. Still, they passed the counterfeit pen test I found in the desk drawer. I wrote her name in the ledger, and as I did, something strange happened. The ink started to spread, bleeding into the paper like tiny veins, forming tendrils that looked eerily like blood vessels. I blinked, and the lines were gone. But my unease only deepened. At 11:55 p.m., I stepped outside to turn off the neon sign, following Rule 1. The desert night was cool and eerily still, with only the faintest breath of wind. The moon hung low on the horizon, unnaturally large, casting long, distorted shadows across the parking lot. As I reached for the switch, something caught my eye. The old Pontiac GTO. It looked like it had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if someone had pushed it a few inches to the left. That couldn't be possible. The thing looked like it hadn't moved in decades, its tires rotting into the pavement. Still, I walked over to check, and that's when I saw it. Fresh scrape marks on the asphalt beneath the tires. My chest tightened as I quickly flipped the switch to kill the neon light and rushed back inside, trying to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the darkness beyond the lot. Back behind the desk, another postcard lay waiting. I was sure it hadn't been there before. Unlike the others, this one was blank, save for a single word scrawled in rust-colored ink. Soon. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came at exactly 12:38 a.m. I remember the time because I was staring at the old clock on the wall, its second hand ticking in a rhythm that was just slightly off. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from the parking lot. "Just a coyote," I whispered to myself. The desert's full of them after all. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random. It was the sound of something dragging itself across the pavement, something heavy. My mind jumped to the Pontiac. Had it moved again? And then came the voice. "Help me, please. It hurts." It was a child's voice, faint and trembling, but something about it felt wrong, like hearing a familiar tune played on an instrument that's slightly out of tune. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. Rule 5. Ignore animal noises from the parking lot. Coyotes shouldn't sound like children crying. But then it got worse. "Daddy?" The voice called again, soft and broken. "Daddy, why did you leave us? Why did you make Mommy cry?" My blood turned to ice. It sounded exactly like Emma, my daughter. But it couldn't be her. Emma was safe in Chicago with Sandra. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack a rib. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was my guilt playing tricks on me. Or worse, something out there new. The crying continued, blending with other sounds, scraping metal, whispered conversations in languages I couldn't understand, and once, horribly, the sound of my own voice, crying for help. At 1:15 a.m., the knock came at room 3. I turned to the security monitor, a grainy black and white CRT screen. On the hallway feed, I saw her. Marie. She was standing outside her own door knocking, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen her leave the room. I switched the monitor to the interior feed for room 3. And yes, there she was, Marie, still inside, lying on the bed, fast asleep. The Marie in the hallway kept knocking, her movements growing frantic. Then she stopped and turned toward the camera. That's when I saw her face. It was wrong. Like someone had tried to sculpt a face from memory but hadn't quite gotten it right. The proportions were off, her features slightly skewed in ways I couldn't explain but couldn't look away from. I killed the monitor, unable to watch anymore. The knocking continued for 3 more minutes, exactly 3 minutes, before it stopped, just as abruptly as it had started. When I dared to turn the monitor back on, the hallway was empty. At 2:15 a.m., the phone rang. My heart jumped into my throat. There wasn't supposed to be a working phone line. I'd checked earlier when trying to get cell service. The old rotary phone on the desk rattled as it rang, each shrill chime cutting through the silence like a knife. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "Blue Swallow Motel," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. "Danny?" The voice on the other end stopped my heart. It was Sandra. "Danny, what did you do?" Sandra's voice sounded distant, warped by static. "Sandra? How did you—" "The collection is coming, Danny," she interrupted. "It's coming because of what you did, and because of what you're going to do. I don't understand." "Yes, you do." Her voice deepened, taking on an unnatural guttural tone. "You always understand too late." I slammed the phone down, my heart racing, but the ringing didn't stop. Panicking, I yanked the cord out of the wall, but the phone kept ringing. Finally, I opened the desk drawer, shoved the phone inside, and buried it under a pile of dusty phone books. That's when I noticed the ledger on the desk had fallen open. The pages had changed. Every entry was now in my handwriting, though I hadn't written a single one of them. The names listed check-in dates for the next week, the next month, the next year, and every guest had the same name, Daniel Sullivan. At 2:45 a.m., the rumble of an engine broke through the oppressive silence. I looked out the front window and froze. A 1955 Cadillac Coupe de Ville was gliding into the lot, its black paint gleaming under the faint moonlight. The car looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, pristine, flawless. Except there was no one behind the wheel. The Cadillac rolled to a stop, headlights aimed directly at the lobby window. My stomach turned as I remembered Rule 6. If a car arrives with no driver, send it to the far lot. Don't let it park near the rooms. That's not where it belongs. My hands shook as I grabbed the PA microphone. "Car in the lot," I said, my voice trembling. "Move to the far lot." The headlights blinked twice in acknowledgement, and the car slowly began rolling toward the far edge of the lot, as if guided by an invisible hand. As it passed under a flickering parking lot light, I caught a glimpse of its license plate. My blood ran cold. The plate read, Sullivan. Before I could even process what I had seen, I heard a door creak open behind me. I spun around to see Marie standing in the hallway outside room 3. She looked worse than before, her skin pale and waxy, almost translucent under the dim lights. She was holding her hands up, and I gasped in horror. Her fingers were turning transparent, the flesh fading like ice melting in reverse. Through her hands I could see the faint outline of her bones, and the wallpaper behind her. "It's starting," she whispered. "The collection. It's almost time." "What's happening to you?" I stammered, stepping back. "The same thing that happens to all of us," she said, her voice filled with quiet resignation. "We become part of it, part of the collection, just like you will." "What collection?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" She smiled sadly, and I could see through her teeth to the back of her throat. "Check the ledger," she said. "Your name is already there. It always has been." I looked down at the guest book. Sure enough, there was my signature, written in my own handwriting, on a check-in form dated 6 months earlier. The ink shimmered, almost alive, twisting and shifting on the page. When I looked back up, Marie was gone. Her red windbreaker lay crumpled on the floor where she'd been standing. Trembling, I flipped through the pages of the ledger. Each entry seemed more sinister than the last. Next to the names and room numbers were notes, symbols, and cryptic warnings. James Peterson, room 7. Do not give him room 3. Linda Martinez, room 12. She brought it with her. Michael Chen, room 3. He opened the postcard. The entries stretched back decades, and one room appeared more often than any other. Room 3. It was always accompanied by those strange symbols, spirals, eyes, and markings I couldn't decipher. Every few pages, I found my own name. Different handwriting, different dates. Some entries were older than I was. A yellowed note slipped out from between the pages, folded into thirds. The handwriting was jagged and frantic. The collection grows. Each piece we leave behind becomes part of it. Our memories, our belongings, our very essence. The motel is a mouth, and we are what it devours. But it needs a curator. Someone to manage the inventory. To send the invitations. At the bottom of the note was a postscript. P.S. Check your wallet, Danny. My hands shook as I fumbled for my wallet. Inside, wedged between old receipts and a credit card, was a postcard I'd never seen before. It was blank on both sides, waiting to be written. That's when the lights flickered, and movement caught my eye. Something slid through the mail slot at the front door, a postcard, but this one was different. It moved as if it were alive, gliding across the floor like a snake. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. If you find an unaddressed postcard in the mailbox, don't open it. The invitation is already written. Don't be curious. But curiosity had always been my weakness. My hands trembled as I picked up the postcard. The paper was warm, almost too warm, as if it had been held in someone's hand moments before. There was no address, no stamp, just a single sentence written in flowing, elegant script. Thank you for accepting the invitation. The collection begins now. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Outside, shadows began to move. They twisted and stretched, merging into shapes that shouldn't exist. Figures began to emerge, tall, elongated, and impossible. The collection had come. The creatures that emerged from the shadows were nightmares cobbled together from the forgotten belongings of guests long gone. One staggered forward, its body made entirely of leather jackets and hiking boots, its head a battered suitcase with a broken zipper that opened and shut like a grotesque mouth. Another dragged itself across the lot, its frame constructed of hundreds of ticking watches and pieces of jewelry. Its movements were accompanied by the eerie sound of mismatched hands marking different times. I saw Marie's red windbreaker among them, now part of a towering, shifting figure pressed against the lobby window. Her face appeared and disappeared in the fabric, her mouth moving in silent screams that I couldn't hear, but could feel deep in my chest. Then the old Pontiac GTO came to life. Its rusted body groaned as it reshaped itself into something no longer a car, but not quite anything else either. It moved like a wounded animal, dragging itself forward on wheels that had twisted into grotesque legs. Its headlights burned with a sickly yellow glow, illuminating the chaos unfolding in the lot. Panic tightened my throat as Frank's warning echoed in my head. The postcards. They're how it spreads. My eyes darted to the desk, where the stack of blank postcards sat innocently, like snake eggs ready to hatch. With shaking hands, I grabbed one of the postcards and a pen. Outside, the creatures were pressing against the windows, their patchwork bodies casting distorted, impossible shadows. I could hear the glass groaning under the pressure, tiny cracks forming and spreading like a spiderweb. Sandra's face flashed in my mind. Not the Sandra I'd last seen, weary and disgusted, but the one I met in college. Her smile had been bright, her eyes filled with trust, her whole life ahead of her, before I ruined everything. I'm sorry, I whispered, as tears stung my eyes. With trembling fingers I wrote, 2. Sandra Sullivan, 1847. Lakeshore Drive, Chicago, Illinois 60611. I hesitated, my pen hovering over the blank space meant for a message. What could I possibly say to prepare her for this? What words could make any of this make sense? The cracking sound grew louder as the window began to splinter further. Through the fractured glass, Marie's face appeared in the red windbreaker, her expression shifting between pity and a terrible, ravenous hunger. I swallowed hard and scrawled the only thing that came to mind. The collection has chosen you. I'm so sorry." With that, I shoved the postcard into the mailbox slot, and everything stopped. The creatures froze mid-motion, their grotesque forms suddenly still. Slowly they began to retreat, dissolving into the darkness as if they had never been. The Pontiac GTO groaned one last time before collapsing into a heap of rust and decay. The cracked window shimmered, the spiderweb fractures melting away as the glass repaired itself, flowing like liquid until it was whole again. I collapsed into the chair, my chest heaving. For a moment, there was only silence, the motel returning to its eerie, unnatural calm. Then my phone buzzed, the first signal I'd had all night. It was a tracking notification. Postcard delivered. The notification popped up on my phone. Postcard sent to Sandra Sullivan. Right below it, another message appeared. "Thank you for your contribution to the collection. Your debt has been noted." The words started to shift and twist as I stared at them. "The curator position has been filled. Training begins tomorrow night." I stayed at the Blue Swallow Motel until dawn, sticking to rule number 8. When the sun broke over the desert, things started to settle, almost returning to normal. The Pontiac GTO was back in its spot, though the rust patterns on it had changed. Now they looked like faces that seemed to stare back at you if you looked too long. Frank came out from the back office, looking exactly the same as he had the night before. "You survived," he said, more like a statement than a question. "I sent it to my ex-wife," I confessed, the words burning in my throat. Frank nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Better her than you, huh? That's what you told yourself?" He took a step closer. "That's what I told myself too, 40 years ago, when I sent it to my brother." He rolled up his sleeve to reveal skin that flickered and shimmered, sometimes almost transparent, like you could see the bone beneath. "The collection always needs a curator, Danny. Someone to manage the inventory, send out the invitations, keep the cycle going." "What happens now?" I asked, the weight of it all crashing in. Frank grinned, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His teeth looked too sharp. "Now, you learn the real rules, the ones we don't write down. Your training starts tonight. And Sandra..." He paused, his gaze cold. "She'll get her invitation soon. Maybe she'll be smarter than we were. Maybe she'll burn it without even opening it. But they never do." That was 6 months ago. I'm still here at the Blue Swallow, learning the true nature of the collection. Every night new guests arrive, each drawn here by their own desperation, by their own needs. Some are running from something, some are running toward something. It doesn't matter. The collection takes them all. I've learned to recognize the signs, the slight shake in their hands when they sign the register, the way their eyes dart around the room, as if they're seeing things that aren't there yet. I've learned to read the symbols in the ledger, to understand the patterns of the collection's hunger. Sandra never called or texted to tell me she got the postcard, but 3 days ago, I saw her name in the ledger, written in that same living, shifting ink. She'll be here soon. Room 3 is already waiting for her. I've thought about warning her, breaking the rules to save her, but I know that the collection doesn't allow it. I've tried. The words turn to ash in my mouth. The phone lines go dead. Emails delete themselves. All I can do now is hope she's stronger than I was. Hope she makes better choices. But mostly, I just watch the neon sign flicker in the desert night, drawing in the lost souls like moths to a flame. I filed their belongings when they leave them behind, sorting each piece for the collection. I send out the invitations, deciding who lives and who becomes part of the growing mass of memories and lost things that haunt this parking lot. That's what curators do. We maintain the collection. We keep the cycle going. We make the hard choices, so we don't have to face the consequences of our own invitation. If you're reading this, consider it my confession. But more importantly, consider it a warning. If you ever find yourself on Route 66 and see the sign for the Blue Swallow Motel, keep driving. And if you get a postcard with no return address, for God's sake, don't open it. Some invitations are better left unanswered. Some collections are better left incomplete. And some debts can never be repaid.